For those of you who may not know me, I'm Cosmo Servideo. I am the Regional Administrator for Region 3 EPA, and I want to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon for our next panel discussion. We're very pleased to have with us an extensive representation of states throughout Region 3, and I have to say the coordination here in Region 3 with our state partners is seamless. It's really a compliment to each state and each state DEP, DEQ. Just a great synergy, coordination, and most importantly, collaboration as we all work towards the protection of human health and the environment, and our counterparts as well as in the Department of Health for each state, and I do thank all of them for that. We know that addressing the challenges of emerging contaminants, such as PFOS, takes a team effort involving local, state, and federal government, as well as academic institutions, non-governmental organizations, and most importantly, the active citizens here, all of you that are here today, but all the citizens here in Region 3. The panel we have assembled here this afternoon will give us a perspective of working on this issue at the state level. I would like now to introduce our panel that we have here today. Lisa Daniels from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, Dr. Sharon Watkins from the Pennsylvania Department of Health, Todd Kaiser from the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, Keith Mensch from the Delaware Department of Health, John Grace from the Maryland Department of the Environment, and Scott Mandarola from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Now we'll hear from our first panelist, Lisa Daniels from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Cosmo. Can everybody hear me okay? I take that as yes? Okay, good. So I'm the director of the Bureau of Safe Drinking Water within DEP. We certainly would like to thank EPA for the opportunity to participate on this panel discussion. Oh gosh, I'm in charge of, and it's not working again, so we might need some assistance. Sure. It could be operator error, but thank you. So next slide, please. Okay. So again, we would like to thank EPA for giving us the opportunity to participate on this panel discussion. We are concerned about per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, otherwise known as PFAS, both in our environment and also in our drinking water. Just a couple of facts. Obviously, the science on PFAS is still evolving. I think you've heard that from each of the speakers that have been up here so far. But PFAS, and the concern that we all have is that PFAS may contain as many as 3,500 to 4,500 different compounds. And right now we know very little about most of them. And according to ECOS, the Environmental Council of States, and AWWA, the American Water Works Association, PFAS has been detected in at least 38 states across the country, including Pennsylvania. So there's a large number of states that are really dealing with this issue. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense in Pennsylvania of what we're dealing with, we have more than 8,500 public water systems across the state. These folks serve water to 11.3 million people. In Pennsylvania, though, we also have an additional 1 million households that are served by private wells. And I think it's important for us to point out that in Pennsylvania, we do not regulate private wells. We have no authority under our Safe Drinking Water Act to do that. And across the country, we're really just one of 2 states that does not have any regulations for well construction standards for private wells. But that does make it challenging for us. Next slide, please. I have a couple of slides here to talk about the state actions that we currently have going on within our program. I'm going to start first with a few pieces of information about the Safe Drinking Water Program, and then I'll get into what our environmental cleanup folks are working on. So within Pennsylvania and under our Safe Drinking Water Act and regulations, we do have the authority to recognize and enforce unregulated contaminants for which there's a health advisory. So if we have reason to believe it's there, On a case-by-case basis, we can order public water systems to take action if there is a risk to public health. In terms of how we implement this long-standing program, and this program goes back to the inception of our Chapter 109 regulations in the mid-'80s, the way we implement this is we use EPA's health advisory values. So that's the value that we use in terms of a trigger for action. Those actions include everything from doing additional monitoring to taking contaminated sources offline, issuing public notification so that the public is provided information to the best of our ability, and then also installing and moving towards long-term treatment. So all of those actions are something that we can do once we become aware of an unregulated contaminant that's above a health advisory level. And while this authority is more stringent than other states, there are absolutely states across the country that can't be more stringent and cannot even sort of implement a health advisory. So while we're a little more stringent in what we can do, this authority still does have its limitations. So for example, we don't have the authority to require across-the-board monitoring for unregulated contaminants. We can only do it on a case-by-case basis or a water system-by-water system basis. And the other thing that we can't do is we're unable to take action for an unregulated contaminant for which there's no advisory at all. There's no health information at all for that contaminant. Next slide, please. Some of the things that the Safe Drinking Water Program has been doing and will continue to do, obviously we're going to continue to work with our other state and federal partners on any of the sites where we have public water systems that are exceeding the health advisory level. And we're going to continue to do that work under our authorities that we currently have. We're also going to continue to participate on several national work groups. Again, as you've heard from some of the previous speakers, the science and the knowledge about these chemicals is a continuing process, and one of the best ways states can be informed is really to stay on some of these national work groups. One of the great work groups that we're on right now is through ASDWA, the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and it's a great way for folks to learn about what other states are doing in terms of this public health challenge. Next slide, please. Also, something we are currently working on, we are developing a monitoring plan. We're going to take that next step and go out and do some monitoring. So we really need to gather additional data across the state and really figure out what kind of occurrence data we have, and it will give us a better idea of a more complete picture of the impacts and sort of where we need to go next with our efforts. The plan is going to prioritize public water system sources for monitoring, and what we're going to use is data layers of known potential sources of PFAS, so known industries, known facilities where these chemicals may have been used. And of course, the available resources that we have towards this program are also going to dictate sort of how big and how large and how quickly we can get out and do this monitoring. The monitoring plan itself will include an action plan, so folks will know where we're headed if we do find something. And again, the action plan is going to be patterned after the existing guidance and protocols we already have in place to deal with unregulated contaminants. And finally, we're going to be posting this monitoring plan on our website, along with sample results once we begin getting those back. So it's going to be available for everybody to take a look at. At the bottom of this slide, you'll see the website. We do have a dedicated PFAS website set up on the DEP website. I'll show it to you again, though, towards the end of the session. So that's what we're doing on drinking water. Next slide, please. We'll go ahead and take a look at some of the actions that our environmental cleanup folks are working on. So our environmental cleanup folks actually rely on two pieces of state legislation, so not federal legislation, state legislation, to give them authority to deal with things like PFAS. So first of all, under our Land Recycling and Environmental Remediation Standards Act, that gives standards, allows them to look at groundwater and soil cleanup standards of regulated substances, and PFAS would qualify as a regulated substance under that program. So there are things that program can do simply because we have a HAL. We have a health advisory level for that substance. The other authority that the program uses is under a Hazardous Sites Cleanup Act, or a HASCA program, and they have the authority to clean up releases of hazardous contaminants, and PFAS is considered a contaminant under that program as well. So right now, through those state authorities, there are things that we can do through the cleanup program simply because we have the ability to react to that HAL level. Next slide, please. Now, the environmental cleanup folks do have some things in the works. The program is going to be developing a new rulemaking that would incorporate toxicity values and soil and groundwater medium-specific values, or MSCs, for both PFOS and PFOA into Chapter 250. These toxicity values would then be used by remediators to demonstrate attainment of these standards. So that is something that's very much in the works. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of how many sites we've been working on throughout the state, to date, our environmental cleanup program has been in some way, shape, or form involved with about 11 sites across the state. So they're doing everything from site investigations to taking interim response actions, or in some cases it's an oversight activity because there's another responsible party that has the lead. There are 2 state-led sites in the state, and on the website link that I had up in a previous slide, you can get much more information about where we're at with those 2 sites. But those are the 2 state-led sites. The remaining sites within the state are either federal-led or they're responsible party-led sites. And again, information is available about those as well. When we are taking the lead on a state-led site, we use money from the HASCA fund to do that. And so we're able to conduct investigations to really determine the extent and nature of the contamination. We're able to collect samples from private wells, and then we're able to initiate interim responses to take care of public health protection. So things like providing bottled water, providing GAC, and then in some cases we're able to move forward and get public water extended to folks that may need it. So again, there are things that we are doing at the state level, even though we're only having a health advisory in terms of our authority to do that, but we've got things in place that allow us to do that. Next slide, please. And here I'll just give you that website address one more time, because if folks want to learn a little bit more about what we're doing at the state level, the authorities that we do that under, and again, more information about the sites that are currently in some fashion being worked on, this website will get you there. Finally, with the last few minutes that I have, we as a state would like to provide a couple of recommendations to EPA. We are certainly supportive and we're thankful for the commitments that EPA made at the PFAS Summit. We think those are great first steps to take. However, we do believe additional action is needed to protect public health. And at this point, we've just sort of narrowed it down to our top 3 recommendations. First of all, we believe EPA must take a leadership role and work with other federal agencies and states and really address PFAS in a holistic fashion. Again, we're hearing 3,500, 4,500 different compounds in this class of chemicals. We can't just deal with them one at a time. So yes, we know something about PFOS and PFOA, but what about the rest of the contaminants? We really need to address this as an entire class. The other thing we think is really necessary is really addressing this in a comprehensive regulatory fashion. So not just drinking water, but also looking at wastewater, waste, soil, and so forth. It's an important piece to be able to address this holistically within the environment. Recommendation number 2, we feel EPA must address PFAS at the national level and develop additional health advisory levels or federal MCLs. I'm here to say states cannot do this work alone. We're just not capable of doing this our own. And failure to address PFAS at a national level will really continue to put public health at risk because some states can do more, other states cannot. And what it will also lead to is really a patchwork of different state-specific numbers, which I don't think are helpful. And it continues to lead to confusion, and folks will continue to question the safety of their water if we don't address this at the national level. Third recommendation, and I know sometimes this is something outside of EPA's control, so I'm asking on their behalf and saying that Congress really needs to provide additional funding for both EPA and the states to deal with this challenge. And as early as this current fiscal year, 18-19 budget, I don't think it's too soon to begin looking at resources that can be given to EPA, ATSDR, and others to make sure that we get the best science we can on these contaminants. I can tell you that current budgets are already stretched thin with EPA and states trying to implement the existing program, and that existing program includes some pretty important stuff like pathogens, like lead, like disinfection byproducts. And working on this type of an issue is only taking resources from someplace else. In addition to the sort of the regulated stuff, a lot of states are dealing with additional non-regulatory drivers, like the outfall from the post-Flint situation and all of those new recommendations that came out of that. We're dealing with things like how harmful algal blooms and Legionella. So again, budgets are stretched pretty thin. I think it's really going to take a bump up in our budgets in order to be able to adequately address PFAS. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity, and I will pass it on to my colleague from the Department of Health.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Sharon Watkins, and I'm the state epidemiologist and the director for the Bureau of Epidemiology for the Pennsylvania Department of Health. And I'd like to thank my colleague for providing the background on PFOS in Pennsylvania for us. Next slide. So I'd like to start with a little bit on what we've been doing on PFAS here in Pennsylvania. So in 2016, we began attending the Department of Defense's Restoration Advisory Board meetings to answer health-related questions on PFAS. We participated in community meetings. We've been participating in national meetings, scientific meetings on PFAS, which I think is very important, as well as national and regional webinars and teleconferences. So our partnerships are with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Council for State and Territorial Epidemiologists, and with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and we work regularly with them on this issue. Next slide, please. In 2016, as was mentioned, we also worked with ATSDR to evaluate cancer incidence rates in the communities near the military bases, and you can see the map that was of interest to us. And this was for the period 1985 to 2013, cancers in that time period. Next slide, please. In 2017, we also prepared 2 addendums to that cancer report, and these were at the request of the community. Addendum 1 looked at pancreatic and pediatric cancer rates, and then Addendum 2 was a little more involved, where we actually geocoded cancer cases to the area and looked at specific denominators or population in the area exactly, not just relying on zip codes. Next slide, please. In 2017, our Secretary of Health, Dr. Rachel Levine, co-signed a letter to the Centers for Disease Control calling for a nationwide study to determine the health outcomes in PFAS-affected communities, both industry and military-related sites. And we have also worked with ATSDR on development of the PFAS exposure assessment technical tools. We just call it the toolkit for PFAS biomonitoring, and we participated in the actual development and review of that toolkit as a state. Next slide. In 2018, we received funding from the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, ASTO, but it actually originated from CDC, ATSDR, to evaluate the toolkit and implement a pilot biomonitoring project which would provide feedback to CDC and ATSDR on the toolkit for use in these national studies that were discussed earlier this morning. The goal is to have approximately 500 residents from households near the military bases here in Bucks and Montgomery County, and these residents will be selected for biomonitoring based on the toolkit. This involves random sampling of residents in this community. We will then communicate the test results to the participant of the study, along with materials to interpret and compare the results, including materials to be used with the physicians, for the residents in case there are questions there. Next slide, please. Residents who live in the area prior to June 2016 are eligible, and blood samples will be analyzed for 11 PFOS. Participants are asked to do an informed consent form, as well as provide information on a questionnaire related to demographics, their length of residence in the community, their exposure. I mean, what's your drinking water? How often do you drink water versus bottled water? Your occupation and health effects. And we are collecting and analyzing that information. We've organized community meetings, multiple meetings, to explain the project and progress, and have had those meetings here in the community. Next slide. So the affected area has a population of over 84,000 based on the 2010 census, which involves around or nearly 33,000 households. And here again is the map of concern. Next slide. I'm not sure you can see all this, but it's telling you that we've gone into the community twice to do random samples and have sent to over 600 households. We have received a response from 275 households expressing interest or declining. Next slide. So our progress so far on this pilot project is that we have contacted 600 households. We have received interest from 232 of those households that were eligible. Eligible participants is now up to about 590 some individuals. That number changes every day. And the participants who have actually gone through and done their informed consent, their questionnaire, and then moved through and actually had their blood taken, so done the biomonitoring part, it was about 125 when we made this slide, but today, as of this morning, it was 140. And those blood clinics, those blood draw clinics are open today, so that number will go up at the end of today. We hope to complete the project within the next 6 months. So if you've received one of these letters and have expressed interest, please fill out the questionnaire and do complete your blood work. We're very pleased to be participating in this pilot study, and we do think it will provide information not just to the community, but inform the national study. Next slide. So recommendations from the Department of Health, we acknowledge that PFOS are a large family of compounds. We've talked about over 3,500 at this point, and there are multiple exposure opportunities requiring a holistic approach at the national level to ensure public health. We really believe there needs to be improved coordination among the Environmental Protection Agency, CDC, ATSDR, and the Food and Drug Administration to facilitate a common approach to assess PFOS exposure and public health impacts. Next slide. Clearly, as has been stated by everyone to date, more research is needed to understand the health impacts of the new and next generation of PFOS. This includes those newly developed compounds that have replaced some of the older ones, and that includes things like next gen. Studies are really needed to understand the full spectrum of health effects, including chronic health effects, and effects of chronic simultaneous exposure to multiple PFOS, and health outcomes in vulnerable populations, such as the elderly, pregnant women, breastfeeding women, immunocompromised, and children really need to be done and assessed. Next slide. Along those lines, epidemiological research is needed to better link the laboratory bench animal studies to real-world exposures in humans through human health research and epidemiological studies. Studies are needed to determine chronic minimum risk levels for PFOS, not just one of them, but as many as possible. And studies to assess health effects due to inhalation exposure are also needed. We're talking a lot about drinking water here, but there are other exposure paths. So studies to assess PFOS exposure through the indoor environment are needed. We recognize that it's understood or estimated that about 80% of PFOS exposure is through consumer products and contaminated indoor environment. And this is particularly of concern for those at higher risk in those environments, such as the elderly, infants, and socially vulnerable populations. I think the bottom line to this is more research is needed, which means more funding is needed. And we thank you for this opportunity to address this issue. I'll turn it over to my next colleague.
Thank you, Lisa and Dr. Watkins. Our next speakers are from Delaware, Todd Kaiser from the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, and Keith Mensch from the Delaware Department of Health.
Thank you. As Mr. Servideo mentioned, my name is Todd Kaiser. I'm a remediation hydrologist with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, Division of Waste and Hazardous Substances. Is that not working? So I want to start out by mentioning that within Delaware, our remediation programs and our drinking water programs are in two different departments. So that's a distinction that needs to be made in the sense that we have to coordinate. We have been coordinating, and we've been successful in doing that, but that is key, and I think that's a key theme of today, is continuing to talk and coordinate our efforts. So the Division of Waste and Hazardous Substances, their Site Investigation and Restoration section, which is a state-level Superfund program, added PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances to their screening level table last year. 2 years ago, excuse me. The HAL value is considered the screening value, and I'll talk a little bit more about what a screening value means in Delaware. Screening values are used to determine when the detection is higher than the screening value. We then begin the process of risk assessment, specifically as it relates to site investigation and remediation. So we're starting to do that now in Delaware. As of July 2nd of this year, the Division of Waste and Hazardous Substances instituted a policy whereby we'd be using EPA method, analytical method 537 modified as a requirement based upon criteria defined in the policy, i.e. basically in areas of interest where we have a reason to believe that there's been a release to the environment of any of the PFAS compounds, the new investigations would be required statewide to look for those compounds and report the detections back. So I do have copies of that policy if I need to pass that off to EPA, but it also is available on the Department of Natural Resources DNREC website. So when we have a detection of a PFAS compound at that investigation through this new policy, if there's a public well involved, we will make sure to immediately be in touch with the Office of Drinking Water to coordinate any of our responses. My colleague, Mr. Mensch, will talk specifically about how we've done that in Delaware in the recent past and go into a little bit more detail on that. We will also be looking at private well drinking water as part of those investigations, following the same procedures in that policy. The policy, and I'll just go into brief detail, if we are doing an investigation within 1,000 feet of an area where we suspect a storage, use, disposal, manufacture of a PFAS compound, or relation to one of a long list of potential facilities that were mentioned earlier today and also are part of standing literature, that's where we'd start to look for. We would also include in those investigations some of those private wells if we believe there's a potential for exposure. So if there is a detection in a private well, we use our standard risk assessment to go about determining whether or not there's an exposure pathway. Not all private wells are all used for drinking water. If it is, we're looking at the exposure pathways and whether or not we have a concern. So within the policy, we are specifically looking at sampling groundwater and surface water within the state of Delaware, not necessarily looking at soil as a requirement. However, there's broad discretion within the Delaware Hazardous Substance Cleanup Act when something is defined as a hazardous substance for the Secretary to say we shall sample for PFAS compounds using an analytical method in soil or in sediment. But our primary concern right now is the potential for an existing exposure through ingestion of this water. So in brief, and from some of the discussions we've had earlier on today, I want to reinforce what Delaware is looking for, and primarily Delaware is looking for US EPA to expedite a regulatory determination as it relates to PFOA, PFOS, whether or not the MCL or other listings as hazardous substances, but give the states something more concrete to work with we have talked about how this is truly a dynamic topic. However, we need to have something to stand upon as we discover more, as opposed to all of us, to the points made by Pennsylvania, doing different things for different logical reasons, but being inconsistent. We have to look to EPA to provide that consistency for us. We're looking for EPA to provide national leadership when it comes to the concept of how to investigate and how to remediate that. EPA early on today did talk about how that is something that they are taking on, something that they are doing. We want to reinforce that. That would be very valuable for Delaware and for all of us. But basically, another big point is taking on the regulatory challenge of determining whether or not there are PFAS compounds still being released to the environment through some sort of production process, through some sort of disposal, but then take steps from a regulatory standpoint or even from a cooperative standpoint with different responsible parties to eliminate that type of release. To try to get a handle on something as it is continuing to be released is very challenging. The topic of materials management came up earlier in the day. We applaud that topic. We think that's really important for us to do, to be able to handle the problem as it continues. So those are the three recommendations specifically from the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. I'll hand this off to my colleague now, Keith Mensch, to speak about the drinking water programs in Delaware.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Keith Mensch. I am the State Drinking Water Administrator for Delaware. As Todd said, our drinking water program, our implementation of the Safe Drinking Water Act is carried out in our Department of Health and Social Services Division of Public Health. PFAS was found in groundwater and drinking water in Delaware going back to 2009 and 10, and again in 2013 and 2015, the latter of which was part of sampling for the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or UCMR 3. This affected 2 large water systems and was suspected of being associated with the Newcastle County Airport and or the Air National Guard base in that same vicinity. Both community water systems installed granular activated carbon at several treatment plants to resolve that situation. It was also found in monitoring wells near Dover Air Force Base and is suspected of being associated with a C-5 crash that occurred in 2006 where the AFFF, the firefighting foam, was used for that crash. More recently, however, late last year, DENREC did some sampling under an EPA grant for PFAS compounds in areas where there were metal plating operations. And PFAS compounds were discovered in a town called Blades. It's a small town in southern Delaware, and there were 2 metal plating facilities in this town, and levels above the EPA's health advisory were found there. So what the Division of Public Health did was we asked the town to go on an alternative water source, drinking water source. So they didn't have an interconnection or anything to use different. There were 3 wells that all 3 had contamination from PFAS. So the National Guard was brought in with water buffaloes and to hand out drinking water to the residents of that town. And the solution options that we went through, there were essentially 3 options: either carbon filtration, an interconnection to the adjacent town of Seaford, which would have required going across a waterway, and to drill new wells into confined aquifers. The fastest and most reliable option was granular activated carbon. So a filtration system was brought in a matter of days out of Pittsburgh, and that was installed, and the samples were subsequently collected and were essentially non-detect for PFAS compounds. So the granular activated carbon worked, and then the town residents could drink their water again. This had a lot of media and political attention and kind of gave us a first-hand perspective at the communication component of this PFAS issue. But the town is not done. They still have to install another granular activated carbon filter because a system like that needs redundancy. You essentially need two of them in case one goes down or in terms of exchanging the carbon when it gets expended. We're also monitoring a situation with another large public water system that is supplied by surface water, where detections below the health advisory level have been found. So we are expecting more issues in terms of drinking water with PFAS in Delaware. Now, what the Division of Public Health would like to see addressed from a drinking water perspective is, first, we believe it should be a priority for a national regulatory structure to be created under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And if there's anything that can be done to expedite the creation of this regulatory structure outside the regulatory review process stemming from UCMR 3, then we would encourage EPA to consider taking those measures. Before that can happen, however, we also believe that laboratory capacity needs to be addressed. There are only a handful of laboratories nationwide that can analyze for these compounds, and if a regulatory structure was implemented now, the laboratories wouldn't be able to handle the volume of samples. So for any laboratories in the process of getting certification for method 537 or any other methods that are revised or created for this, if there's funding available or even just for EPA to expedite the certification process administratively, that would be helpful. Delaware's Public Health Lab is working on this issue now to get certified for method 537. Also, the current EPA Method 537 Revision 1.1 includes 14 PFAS compounds. 6 were included in UCMR 3. 2 currently have a health advisory level. And as we've discussed, there are over 3,500 of these compounds with varying degrees of potential public health effects, some unknown. So in terms of a regulatory structure and laboratory methods, we would like to see a system created that addresses these differences, which may include EPA laboratory methods revision. And again, I'd just like to thank the EPA for inviting the state of Delaware and all of our other Region 3 states. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd and Keith. Our next speaker is John Grace from the Maryland Department of the Environment. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you for inviting us as well. I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts on PFOS for this occasion. Maryland Department of the Environment has the responsibility and the authority to protect its natural resources, and in particular to protect the safety of its drinking water for its citizens. The fact that we're talking about PFOS means that our community, our society's multiple barrier approach for drinking water protection has failed. That's why we're here. And if we can't understand why it failed, why it is failing, then we're not going to get a better strategy. EPA is asking us for input on how to develop a better national strategy. I think each person here has something to contribute to that. I appreciate the fact that states were given a special time to talk about the role that we have. I've been on the ground, I guess, for 3 decades, helping communities protect their sources of drinking water. Drinking water is typically taken for granted, except when it's not there or when it becomes contaminated. We, as a community of people, need to do a better job emphasizing the importance of protecting our sources of drinking water. I think that's one of the first things that this national plan should do, figure out better ways of enhancing the protection of our sources. I have a background in groundwater hydrology, and Maryland has been called America in miniature. We have every geologic setting in our state. There is no one-size approach that fits all. And it takes a concerted effort to develop programs that take into account the varied hydrogeologic settings and the varied land uses and the land use history in our states. So, along, two parts I just want to mention on that point were approval of new well sites. Our staff, my staff goes out, does inspections before approving a new well site. The problem is we don't know the full history of land use in the area that might contribute water to that well. And in particular, no one in the 30 years that I've been doing this has asked the question, was that an area where they had to put out a fire with firefighting foam? So we have this great gap in the reality of what's happening on the landscape and the information that we have at our fingertips to assess the safety of our water supplies. So that's part of the need of the national plan is the help, and someone mentioned it already, I think in Delaware's comments, that the strategies for investigation and knowledge of all the sources of this class of contaminants, which is incredibly complex, how do you translate that knowledge to the sanitarian or the engineer who's out in the field, who's actually making the decisions on whether or not a source, a community should spend $50,000 or $100,000 or $250,000 on a new well field? So these are important components. In addition, how do local planning agencies get the knowledge that they need to make good decisions on what kind of land uses they should be approving in their wellhead protection areas? It's a great challenge. I don't have there's no magic bullets, but there needs to be more resources put into it. That's clear. Lisa mentioned, and I want to reemphasize, it can't all fall on the drinking water program. We're not the source of the contamination, right? Our water suppliers aren't the ones who are causing the contamination. So we have to have strategies in place that are going to address all the sources and understanding the sources and controlling the sources. I started out with the Department of the Environment in the Industrial Wastewater Pretreatment Program. Back in 1985, I think we had 126 or 129 priority pollutants. Now, 30 years later, we still have the same number of pollutants. There needs to be better connectivity between the NPDES program and the Safe Drinking Water Act program. All right, the one point that's been made over and over again is that this is not an easy class of compounds. They are persistent, and they are complex, and there are many of them. So, how do we actually develop a monitoring program that effectively determines whether or not these compounds are present in levels that might cause health effects? I think this is a great opportunity, actually, for some of the projects, research that are ongoing to be put into practice, and that is the whole concept of whole water toxicity. In the NPDES program back in the 80s, we began whole effluent toxicity. Back in the 80s, that's 30 years ago, and here we are in the drinking water program, never really starting that process. Why can't we develop methods that consider whole water toxicity? I think there's been tons of progress. I mean, it was alluded to this morning in the research that EPA is doing, in the assessments that they use. Why can't we think about how to develop that for on-the-ground implementation for monitoring community water systems, public water systems, private wells? Just want to make the point, about 15% of our state relies on private wells. Nationally, I think the number is 13% of the population. It's an incredibly important portion of this issue. Private wells are typically shallower and more vulnerable and more likely to have gross levels of contamination if they're proximal to a source than a public water supply. We cannot ignore the issue of private wells. I think just two more points here, and again, I want to echo what Lisa said about the need for resources. Our resources are stretched thin. And to tackle a problem like PFOS is going to require more resources. And resources should be put into research and also at the state level to help with discovery and guidance to local communities. Finally, this is not a state problem, a federal problem, a community problem, the problem of the homeowner whose well is contaminated. This is all of our problem. And we need to work together and listen together and learn from each other to develop a better template, a better methodology for ensuring the safety of our water supplies. Thank you for listening. I appreciate being here.
Thank you, John. Our last speaker is Scott Mandarola from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank EPA for inviting us here. West Virginia typically gets left out a lot of these type, not by Cosmo, but in the past we have, I will say that. West Virginia's in a unique situation with relation to these compounds. We have one of the oldest sites in the country, and recently in 2014 we found out that we have one of the newest sites in the country. Obviously, the older site we're talking about is the Washington Works DuPont site. C8 been used in the manufacturing process there since the early 50s. In the 90s and early 2000s, potential health issues began to become evident. In 2001, EPA, DEP, Department of Health and Human Resources in West Virginia entered into a consent order with DuPont, and it involved doing additional testing. It was an informational gathering more than anything as far as an order was concerned. And this was in an effort to find out how extensive the situation was and how widespread. In 2009, that same group, EPA, West Virginia DEP, West Virginia DHHR, entered into a consent order with DuPont requiring two main things, and it's an extensive order, but I'm going to touch on the two main issues that it addressed. Testing of public and private drinking water sources within a 1 to 3 mile radius, depending on what was found, and providing alternate drinking water sources or treatment of those drinking water sources if it was detected above the then 400 parts per trillion health advisory level. In 2017, following the update of that advisory level, which occurred in 2016, there was a modification to that order, and it incorporated the 70 parts per trillion. It also expanded the testing area based on the historical contamination and the patterns of contamination. What was determined from these replacement sources that there has been 20 wells total in West Virginia impacted. Now that number seems a little low, but part of that is because this Washington Works facility is in the Parkersburg area, and there's a number of public water systems in that area that supply water to West Virginia residents. But those 20 wells have been addressed either through treatment, hooking them up to a public drinking water source, providing an alternate source of drinking water. In Ohio, across the river, and you would think based on the area that the Washington Works facility is, that it wouldn't travel, it would seem for it to enter into Ohio through air deposition, it would be traveling west. But in actuality, the way the river curves there, it's more of a northeast wind pattern. But 67 wells have been identified in Ohio, and they're all private wells as well. There's been 4 water systems affected by this where treatment has been installed in relation to this order. The main issue, as I mentioned, with this facility is air deposition. We've done a lot of testing with the water discharges, and although there is discharges through the NPDES permit, it's into the Ohio River, and there's a tremendous level of dilution available there. The new NPDES permit, the reissuance of that permit has come out of the public notice. It's about to be reissued. The draft that was put out to public notice contains limits for the first time for both C8, based on the 70 parts per trillion, and for their new compound being used there, Gen X. And it's based on the 140 parts per trillion that North Carolina came up with. Additionally, EPA has been very helpful recently in that they're requiring, as well as testing for C8 in these surrounding wells, there's been a letter issued to DuPont that's required testing in a number of locations for the new compound to try to evaluate the possible air deposition effects that may be occurring due to the use of Gen X now. The second site I want to talk about very briefly is the Martinsburg site. And again, this is a site similar to a lot of the discussions we've heard earlier from the other panelists. This was discovered in the EPA Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule testing in 2014. At the time, it was below the threshold that was considered of concern. In 2016, when that threshold changed, it became problematic. There were studies done. DEP worked with DHHR. In our state, DHHR also regulates. They regulate the drinking water. The DEP does not. But we work with them very closely, and in doing that study, it was determined that the most likely source was the 167th Air Guard facility that's at the airport there. Martinsburg was in the process of entering into a contract with DOD to treat their new well, which is the Big Spring treatment facility. This is a relatively new, high-flow, deep well in that area to supply water for the Martinsburg area, the growth, and the alternative source that they have, although functional, is very susceptible to drought conditions and low flow conditions. It's caused them serious issues in the past, so that's the purpose of the new well. Once they determined that this was a contaminated source, they stopped using it, relied on the alternative until such a time as they could get treatment. When this contract with DOD to put treatment was put on hold, Martinsburg moved forward, spending approximately $4.9 million to put in treatment. It's a relatively big facility. And the big ask, I would say, from West Virginia, in addition to, I'm not going to go through the time and effort of repeating what the previous states have indicated as help required by EPA. I think everybody's heard that to this point. But small communities like Martinsburg that are put in a situation where they now have identified a potential health contaminant in their drinking water need the ability to move forward quickly, installing treatment with some expectation that if they meet the requirements that would normally be looked at for DOD to enter into a contract with them to treat the system, that there's some reasonable expectation that they could potentially be reimbursed for that amount of money. $4.9 million may not seem like a lot of money for, you know, when you're sitting in a big area like the Philadelphia area here, but in Martinsburg, West Virginia, this is a huge output of money. But it's very important, in my mind, for communities to be able to act fast in an effort to assure that the health of their citizens is protected and they have safe drinking water, with some expectation that they may be able to become reimbursed if they meet the qualifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our states and their participation today. Their points are very much appreciated and valuable to EPA, but again, as I stated when I started, our collaboration with our state partners is such a focus for EPA, as you know, particularly with this issue. But I want to thank our panelists again, and I want to thank all of you. We'll just take a few minutes to transition to our next panel, which is the local communities panel. So thank you so much, and thank you again to all the states.